أرحب بكم جميعا.
This session is about protecting investigative journalists from legal threats, and I'm sure you follow up on the situation of Arab countries and indicators related to the freedom of the press and the freedom to access of the internet. And we have Freedom House in the two indicators. The two indicators point out that we don't have any free Arab country. They are either partially free or not free at all. 4 days ago, the latest indicator about the internet freedoms in the Arab world, and it turned out that there are 3 Arab countries which are partially free, and Tunisia was on top of them. We have 124 countries around the world which have laws on access to information, and 6 Arab countries are among them. As for our IT rating, we find that the situation of the Arab or the ratings of Arab countries is not good. Jordan is at the 8th from the bottom. Given lack of guarantees for journalists to access information, journalists start to rely on other sources, either with less information, and some sources spread disinformation or rumors. They could be a fertile ground for rumors. In democracies, we know what the role of the press since the days of a British official who called the press or journalism as the fourth power or authority. Burke, sorry. Even countries which are democratic and free, sometimes the guarantees for the freedom of the press is not enough, and one of the guests will be talking about the changing situation in the US in the last 20 years. However, mainly in Arab countries, although the press should be the power or the authority that monitors governments, but what we have in reality is that governments are monitoring the press, and sometimes journalists are prosecuted unfairly, and at times they might cut them with a jigsaw. And investigative journalists work in unfavorable environments, and sometimes in hostile environments or aggressive environments. Investigative journalists nowadays and their role in society is like the poem, which means that journalists do not sleep. They are alert 24 hours. One of their eyes closes, the others stay alert. Otherwise, governments will not be monitored. And if this happens, we will have corruption and wrongdoing, etc. So the powers of the press are strong and solid, and someone should monitor the journalists or journalism, and this has to be taken into consideration. They should be held accountable. And since the times of the merchants in Iraq and Syria, the industry or the profession should be monitored from the old days. And that's why journalists should not only be professional, but they should commit to the ethics of journalism. And maybe we will ask the guests about this. We have with us three colleagues, and they are distinguished in the industry. We have Rahada Abdoush, who is a lawyer and a journalist at the same time. She is a Syrian legal counsel in the Syrian female journalists, and she's a trainer on media fields in the media field. You have supervised some investigations by ARIJ, right? For ARIJ, yes, she says. We have Mr. Alexander Papachristou, who is the executive director at the Funds Institute, and he offers free of charge consultations, legal consultations to and he has a PhD from Harvard University, and he's qualified enough to be appointed a minister in Jordan. So I start with Mr. Mohammad Qtishat, given in light of our friendship. He was one of the pioneering lawyers who defended journalists' rights in courts, and he rarely ever lost a case in this field, and the courts even benefited from his work, and he convinced the courts in many times that the press or journalists were innocent. And he was the former Director General of the Media Commission in Jordan, and he resigned of his will. I do not know the reason why he resigned, but he's popular among journalists. And they wrote in his favor before he was appointed and after he resigned. The first question, I will ask the first question to Rahada. Given the situation in Syria that we are all aware of, what are the things that could endanger investigative journalists? Hello, I want to answer this through a report that we prepared on press laws in Turkey, Syria, and neighboring countries, including Jordan and Lebanon. After examining these media laws, we realized that the laws themselves were restrictive instead of being supportive of the freedom of opinion or expression. We found that these laws were restrictive through certain articles, such as working against public morals and restricting them through or under the constitution or under the pretext of national unity and national security. And from here, I want to talk about loose texts that hold journalists accountable. Should I discuss this now or later? Maybe later. We will ask the same question to Mr. Mohammed. Given your experience in defending journalists, what are the main mistakes that investigative journalists fall in or make that could subject them to prosecution? And standing before the court is not that serious, but the thing is that the time spent or wasted during the prosecution. He was the one who trained me on this. When it comes to investigative journalism, the legal framework for investigative journalism is different from the framework related to publishing or posting a news or an article or an opinion article. Also for the legal accountability, is different. When it comes to a report or a feature, things differ. One of the mistakes that a journalist might commit, which might be a professional error, is not doing his job or his homework in collecting information. So they need to search and look for information and to collect this information. So they might be derelict in this. Journalists might think that they have collected enough information to publish his or her investigative report. So the first tip, the first advice is to have sufficient evidence or strong evidence that can be reflected in the way you write. So if the evidence is weak, you should not this might lead to changing the meaning. So instead of saying stealing material, you can say instead lost material, or some material was lost. So you should soften the way you write. Also, the overlap of sources is not is a professional thing. Now, you can get information from more than one source. And this should be a basic point that you need to commit to. Also, the change in sources, which is also sensitive. A witness that you think might present his testimony in the courts might decide not to do that. Also, some journalists, when you ask them to write, we find out that they do not have the legal tools to prepare reports, proper reports. They should know how to write, how to deliver the message without being exposed to legal accountability through smearing or defaming or swearing. And given that investigative reporting is about uncovering the hidden issue, so my first tip here is to show goodwill and to criticize the phenomenon without defaming or without attacking the persons or the characters. And if you have a hidden camera or hidden recording, you need to look into the legal articles or the law in your country to know whether or not such an act is punishable by law or not. Thank you, Mr. Mohammad. Alexander, the U.S., frankly speaking, had the first constitution in the world. It was written in the U.S., and it's the only constitution that talks about one profession, which is journalism, and it talks about the freedom of journalism. And the Supreme Court in the U.S. set in place rules, great rules related to protecting journalists. However, in the last 20 years, the ranking of the U.S. in relevant indicators retracted by around 25 points. And in the last 3 years, we are hearing to strange concepts, and we're seeing many fake news. And yesterday we heard about saying who faked this whistleblower. So how do you, Alexander, assess journalism in a democratic country like the U.S.? And the other thing, the U.S. is not only might prosecute an Arab or a Jordanian journalist in the U.S. And since for 7 years now, they've been asking for Assange to be reported and prosecuted.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English. If anybody wants a minute to get the translation device, please. I apologize for speaking in English.
Alexander.
شوية. I'm very honored to be with my colleagues and with all of you here in Jordan. I came to Jordan the first time 40 years ago as a student of Arabic in Egypt, taking a boat from Port Said to Aqaba, and then using my thumb, hitchhiking from Aqaba to Amman. And I've been back many times since then, and each time I return, I miss it more, and I speak less Arabic than before. So I'm sorry for that. The case of Julian Assange is a very important one in the United States, and I think for journalists around the world, because it concentrates several of the trends to which you referred over the last 20 years, and particularly in the last few years. Let's remember that Julian Assange is not an American journalist. He's from Sweden or Australia or wherever, I don't know, Australia. And some say he's not a journalist. But in the United States, the laws don't depend on whether you are a journalist or whether you are American. You have the same constitutional rights if you're not an American as if you're an American, with a few nuances. And also you are subject to the laws of the United States, it seems, even if you're not in the United States. And so for a journalist in Jordan or elsewhere in the Arab world, there is a risk of facing justice in the United States. And particularly if, let us say, you receive some US government secrets, somebody has hacked or leaked these secrets and delivers them to you, information about US military sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia to be used in Yemen, for example. And this is important information that you publish here in Jordan or in another country. You can be subject to justice in the United States. And so the Assange case is an important one. I don't want to keep talking. I can perhaps return to some of the issues in that case. I did just want to say a little bit, if I could, about my organization. We are lawyers in the United States providing free legal help, it's true, to human rights organizations, environmental organizations, and journalism organizations around the world. We do this because we can convince lawyers in law firms everywhere in the world, even in Jordan, to work with us for free in important cases of significant public interest. And we have done some work in Arab countries, working with journalists who are writing about US companies or the US government, and those journalists were concerned about the risk to them of legal action in the United States. So I would invite everyone to take some information that I left at the front, if there is any left, and also to be in contact if you need legal help with issues that arise in your journalism. And we would very much like to try to help you.
شكرا. رهادة الأوضاع
Rahada.
أعملها وما أعتقد إنه ربنا يستجيب بسرعة. مش قلة ثقة في ربنا بس المشاكل في
Prayers, because the problems in Syria are too many, but we need to take this opportunity to hear from you about the legal framework and about the environment there. You have some old laws in Syria that date back to the 60s, and for instance, it's not allowed to raise or to keep a certain kind of pigeons. It's the carrying pigeons which used to carry messages. I'm not aware of this information. This doesn't have to do with keeping this type of pigeons, but it's not banned to raise these pigeons, but they cannot testify in courts. And raising pigeons could be like a drug abuse. The environment for journalists is tough. We have very restrictive laws for journalists, but the journalist himself or herself should be knowledgeable about these laws to understand the challenges that they face. I should know more about the law and what is the possibility that I will be held accountable. And I need to know whether or not this investigation that I'm conducting is worth it or not. And the main thing is to have the knowledge, sufficient knowledge, and to have the evidence or the documents. And when we take documents, I'm talking here about documentation. We need to document our investigation. It's not about writing and folding a piece of paper and hide it, but we're talking about official documents and certificates from the forensic medicine. For instance, everything should be official and stamped. This is the type of documents that I need to keep. Although in Jordan there is a law on protecting sources, but in Syria this law is loose or does not exist. But we always benefit from or make use of international agreements. So these international agreements support our work, especially resolutions issued by the Security Council, because they are binding. For instance, Resolution 1325, which talks about women in armed conflict. All these resolutions help us in our work in writing and reporting, and they support us before the law and before the public eye. So such international agreements supersede local laws, and they do support us. So the first thing is knowledge. The second thing is documents or documentation, and telling the whole truth, not half truths.
أستاذ محمد.
Mr. Muhammad, it is known that a government official, even Minister of Information, a former Minister of Information, has to apply the law, and there's a difference. The quality of the law itself, the quality of drafting the law. What is the secret formula that you used when you were an official and a journalist? You applied the law because you are part of the executive branch, and when you left it, journalists wished you had continued in your position. What is the difference between the quality of the law and quality of enforcing the law? It is knowing the role, knowing the roles of each. When the official is fully aware who is tasked with enforcing the law, when that official is fully aware of the role and limitations of journalism and his own role in enforcing the law, any part of the law which he or she has to enforce. Maybe not all the people who are listening to us are Jordanians, but Jordanians are fully aware that the press and publications law and the audiovisual media law, there are two chapters in each law. One that regulates the presence of media organizations. Another chapter, the legal liability for acts or mistakes done by the media or in the media. The last chapter, which is the liability for mistakes committed, I was fully aware that I had no role in related to that chapter. The parties responsible for enforcing that chapter are the journalist, the complainant against that journalist, the judge, the prosecutor, or the person who is seeking civil compensation for damages, and the legal provisions themselves. Therefore, I refrained from filing complaints against journalists or against media organizations. I refrained from referring them to public prosecutor or prosecutor general, and from banning publication or interfering in the publication of issues related to public opinion. I fully dedicate myself to a regulatory role, purely regulatory role. How to regulate the media, to organize the media from the realities of legal provisions and texts. Because I come from a legal background, I was fully aware that the fair provision, fair text, a good text with a bad enforcement is worse than an unfair provision fairly enforced. Therefore, I focused on fair implementation of some provisions and articles that I thought were, and I still believe they are, unfair in giving licenses and the conditions related to issuing licenses. When an official recognizes that the role of the press as a fourth estate and that it is a party that has oversight and monitors its action, when they realizes his role is that he is not a judge, he is not to hold people accountable, when he knows fully and realizes that his role or her role is a part of a sensible state, a sane state, is a basic part of the brains of a state that knows the weight, the value of the press being a main part of the strength of the state, and a weak press is a weak state. When that official knows that, he will stand in support of the press. Okay, let us benefit from the presence of Mr. Alexander. The international agreements, frankly speaking, Arab countries rush to sign conventions. It is the first country who signed the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court. It was the president of that committee. But when Omar al-Bashir arrived here, came to Jordan, Sudanese president, he was not arrested. I wanted to benefit from Mr. Alexander because he has a PhD. He also a PhD from Harvard and maybe a master's degree and also in the law. How could a journalist draw on the benefit from the international conventions that to compel the country to arrest that person, for example, and the decisions of regional courts, like the Inter-American Human Rights Court or the European Human Rights Court, etc.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm not sure that I'm fully competent to answer it, but the enforcement of international agreements or regional agreements, the European Convention on Human Rights and the Inter-American Declaration and Convention on Human Rights, in Latin America or in the Americas is a difficult and uncertain opportunity for not only journalists but other people. And outside of the Council of Europe and outside of the Americas, there are no international agreements governing human rights or free press or free speech that can be enforced through mechanisms of this kind. There are procedures of the United Nations to review periodically the application of international conventions guaranteeing political and civil rights and other specific rights, but these processes don't really afford any opportunity for an individual person to get anything more than simply confirmation that her or his rights were violated. There's no penalty that can be obtained against the government in these international agreements. The Convention Against Torture does, which I believe most every country has signed, does have a mechanism for an individual who is a victim of torture to pursue a claim against the state that tortured him or her. But these different processes that do exist require going through the whole system of justice in the country that is the perpetrator of whatever violation is in question, and the so-called exhausting of remedies, and then petitioning for review by the European Court or the Inter-American Court or the Committee on Torture. These processes take a long time and are not so easy to follow. So unfortunately, there is not much international justice available for journalists or other people who have suffered a violation of their human or civil rights.
شكرا. بالمناسبة في كافة الانقلابات العربية اللي كانت تنجح كان اللي سيطر على الميكروفون ينجح الانقلاب. وقد أكشف لكم سر، في 1959 لما صارت الانفصال بين الجمهورية العربية المتحدة الإقليم الشمالي والجنوبي مصر وسوريا، آنذاك الانقلابيين سيطروا على إذاعة حلب فقط وما معهم قوات أصلا، وكان بدهم يفشلوا تماما. آنذاك تم ربط إذاعة حلب مع إذاعة كانت تبث لمصر على طريق البحر الميت في نقطة عسكرية، الأنتينات تبعتها هناك ربطوها معها، والانقلابيين نجحوا ومش عارف صاروا قادة الفرق العسكرية يعلنوا التأييد، وهكذا نجح الانفصال. بدناش نعمل مثل الدول العربية نسيطر على الميكروفون، بدنا نعطي الحق للشعوب كمان تحكي. المتداخل بالله يحكي اسمه لأمور التسجيل وأمور
documentation purposes. Thank you. Good afternoon. Dr. Hassan, Director of Investigative Journalism, الحياة الجديدة, and lecturer at university. To begin with, I am very proud with the presence of Mr. Mohammad Qtishat and Ms. Yahia Shukkair and other colleagues in the panel. In 2011, I was trained by Mr. Qtishat. I used to say, oh, this day is so boring. We are going to have a lawyer who is going to act as a teacher and teach us what journalism is. And that day passed. But after that, I knew the value of that day, because now I became a legal reference in Gaza for investigative journalists. And because there isn't a lawyer who is specialized in the media information law, and now we are producing investigative reports. Now I am the one who reviews them from the legal aspect. We have a lawyer, Mr. Kuman, who was still he started consulting me on regarding media issues, and all of that was the credit to all of that goes to that day that we thought was a boring day, but which was very beneficial. It included that some articles in Palestinian law, an article article says that the judge could rule that to exonerate the journalist if he felt that the ultimate purpose is public interest. I know it by heart from that training day from Mr. Muhammad. Therefore, it is now a main item in the Defense Council for a journalist who was tried in absentia for 6 months to sentence. And all the councils of that team relied on that article. And I want to say that focusing on the legal aspect for journalists in order to protect themselves is something that we recognized and realized while we were working on the job. But of course, governments do not leave us alone. Every now and then they come up with laws. We had the Press and Publications Law, and then later electoral crimes law in the West Bank and Gaza, and even Hamas in Gaza has its own article saying that the criminal procedures law, it's not the poor abuse of the cyberspace, of the abuse of electronic space is something to be punishable by law. So this is not directed to journalists, rather to citizens. Thank you so much for what you have said. It's not the problem that you have Hamas and Fatah. The Press and Publications Law is 1936, the British one, which is much better than the Palestinian law, the first one that was enacted after the return of Yasser Arafat, just to say. And the first decision taken by Arafat before he went to Jericho is that the laws shall remain enforced, applicable. There are 4 laws in Palestine. Press and Publications Law in Gaza is better than the one in the West Bank. Good afternoon. I am not a journalist. I am an academic researcher from Iraq. Unfortunately, so far, detention, abduction, and beating, physical abuse is a daily reality experienced by journalists in Iraq. Demonstrations continue. Some people disappear. Some are tortured. Others pay the tax for this unstable condition in Iraq. And those are the journalists. Some people, if they have a post on Facebook or in Twitter, they are followed and they are taken and interrogated. I imagine in the region, the countries, if they want to seize, so to speak, a person, they will have a justification. They will have, if they have, they will find themselves a text to do it. But officials have not reached a level of comprehension that journalists are independent. But also, we have journalists who have their own ideology, and when they work, they raise issues and harm other journalists and create instability. This is a point that I need to draw attention to. Some institutions might be called empires in the field of journalism, but they call for very bad ideologies and affected poorly the reputation of journalists in the Middle East. Thank you. Good afternoon. My question regards legal violations and the overlapping of powers between the various branches. For example, we have administrative detention. This is applied in several countries in the region. How can we protect ourselves from that in the future, and how can we keep ourselves on the safe side? And if we do fall in such a problem, how do we act? Any other questions? Go ahead. Good afternoon. Ms. Abudalu, journalist and fourth-year law student. We know that judiciary is the platform of right, while the press is the platform for facts. I work in the press, and now I am experiencing some contradiction. If one day I post something on Facebook, a news item or a picture, etc., by law, this is transgression that I would do to post someone's picture without their permission. At the same time, as a journalist, this is my job to seek the truth and the facts and people to see the news item. So this is a contradiction that I am facing these days. I am a lawyer at the end of the day. At the same time, I'm practicing journalism. Go ahead, Mr. Hamid. I have a question to Mr. Mohammad Qtishat. When you resigned, us journalists, when you resigned from the being a minister of the cabinet, we're not happy about that. A question as you are being independent lawyer, what are the obstacles that prevent developing the laws of the media and the press in Jordan, or preventing them from keeping pace pardon me, being as an equal level to international standards? Why are not they becoming like that? I am from Jordan. Yemenis are Jordanian. We'll give them a positive discrimination to our Yemeni colleagues. Good afternoon, Aya Khalid, a broadcaster, writer, correspondent. We are all talking about the laws in the press and publications law in general, all others related to media organizations. Unfortunately, in Yemen, we don't have any law for media organizations or a law for press and publications. Nevertheless, if we want to produce even if a simple report or even a television report or an investigation, maybe a report is easier than investigative report, we find that there is any law that we can refer to. Any security measures needed, we would do them, any licenses, and everybody knows that Yemen is under the control of two governments, the de facto government and the legitimate government. I am in the legitimate government, and for me, in Ta'as, for example, in order for me to go and shoot a certain report, whether for the television or a press report, I have to take a permit from several factions or parties in the same city. So local authorities are there's a multitude of local authorities that I need to do that. Maybe a report could be, it has nothing to do with the politics. Nevertheless, I will have to pass through several legal steps. Nevertheless, I will remain under being surveyed. I will be under threat and control. In this condition, what should we do? Maybe now I'm a journalist from outside Yemen, and I can stay inside Yemen. Nevertheless, I cannot, because my families are present in Yemen, in some regions, I cannot even make a report as I would like to. This is how we live under these circumstances. Even if we have laws are not enforced. Basma Shebani, a broadcaster. A question to Mr. Mohammad Zuhair. You said that journalists should know the details of the law related to a hidden camera. what if the journalist working on investigative report in a foreign country, not his own country? Which law would be applicable in that case? In BBC, for example, there was an investigative a film documentary about girls in Iraq, and then she traveled from Iraq. How would she will be held accountable after she left the country, or wouldn't she be held accountable legally, I mean? Good afternoon, Ahmed Hibber, law student, 4th year. My question, why so far we don't have a specialized entity specialized in defending journalists and raising awareness of journalists? Why until now the presence of a lawyer is a luxury at any media organization? Every year we have a law that affects or infringes on the press and publications law. And now I don't know how you are going to convey that the fact to Mr. Alexander that lawyers who are defending journalists were referred to a certain case. I'm not sure what was that, to a disciplinary action. They were referred to disciplinary committee. So I don't know how we will have more freedom of expression. Thank you. Allow me, please, to start from Ms. Rahada. I want to start from public interest. When you talk about public interest, it's very important so that there would not be no punishment or to exonerate a journalist. Of course, it is very important to have something in public interest. This is an indication and a reason for exonerating journalists, but it is also important to have the documents, proof documents. If there are no documents to prove that, then there's nothing that can prompt the court to exonerate them. There was a journalist who was detained for with the charge of writing against the Aleppo governor, but he was exonerated because it was in public interest and also because he had official documents from the criminal authorities, forensic authorities. Also, you're talking about our colleague that unfortunately there is no press and publications law. But it is the most absolute law is that there is no law for press and publications. We seek that there would be to have codes of conduct, codes of professional conduct, code in each media organization, and there shouldn't be any press and publications law. The rule now is for the security aspect. The law and the security do not go hand in hand. The security aspect does not follow any criteria. It's just like an emergency kind of law. It's an arbitrary one. No one can hold the other accountable because of it. These were the 2 points I wanted to talk about.
Thank you. Well, I first want to add to my previous answer. I neglected to mention the African Court of Human and People's Rights and the African agreements on human rights. So this is a third regional mechanism besides Europe and the Americas. I can just very briefly mention a few important facts about the Julian Assange case, if you wish. So we've become very nostalgic about the Obama years in the United States, but in fact, it was during his presidency that the government started to crack down most harshly on government officials who leaked information to journalists. More government officials were subject to criminal prosecution in the Obama years than in all of previous American history. You can say that's because there is more and more government secrecy. Every year there are more secrets, but still the Obama presidency was quite hard on the leakers, the government officials who leaked information. But what we see with President Trump is something much worse. Julian Assange was not a leaker. Julian Assange received the leaked information from Chelsea Manning, who went to prison, of course. And this is the first time in American history that the person receiving the leak was prosecuted. I shouldn't say the first time. There was one other case a few decades ago, but that case never proceeded. It stopped. And the Assange case, if it goes ahead, if he's brought to the United States, won't stop, I'm sure. The government will prosecute him if they can get him to the United States. And he is accused of not only violation of computer fraud and abuse law, which is what the Obama administration considered prosecuting him for, but decided not to prosecute him because of the risk of intimidating journalism. So the Obama administration wanted at least to encourage journalists to do their jobs. But the Trump administration has gone beyond that crime and is accusing Julian Assange of espionage. And instead of 3 years in prison, the maximum penalty for his charges is 10 years in prison. What's important about the case against him is that he is accused of espionage not only for helping Chelsea Manning to obtain the government information, but also he is accused of espionage for publishing the information. Simply for putting it on the internet, he is accused of espionage. So for investigative journalists everywhere in the world, there is at least a risk that publishing US government secrets, which you receive from whatever source, could be considered espionage in the United States. Now, because he's accused does not mean that he's guilty. And in the US system, as you know, the decision of whether he's guilty depends on the judges hearing his case. And in fact, the law itself is defined by the judges. And right now in the United States, the law decided by judges is that a journalist can use information that was obtained illegally as long as the journalist did not participate in obtaining the illegal information and as long as the information is in the public interest. So the accusation against Assange must come up against this law, and there must be a decision, if he is to be sent to prison, whether the law has changed. And the courts will decide this, but it is indeed, at this point, a risk, a threat to journalists everywhere. Thank you.
شكرا. فيما تبقى من دقائق وكان عندي أنا عدة أسئلة. ما مدى حجية التصوير والتسجيل بدون إذن نيابي؟ خطورة انتحال الشخصية، العمل أندر كفر.
I'm sorry. I had many questions in mind, and but time is tight. As you know, Mr. Mohammed's office is nearby. But if you seek advice in the office, you will pay against this advice. Okay, I will. When we talk about balancing between rights, you need to balance between the interests. Is it the right to knowledge or the right to the accused to a fair trial? The principles of fair trial is more important than the public's right to knowledge. And please pay attention to which takes more priority. So this is your job. This is an effort that you should put, and given that you are a lawyer, this is the answer you should give to others. So you need to balance between interests, not rights. As for administrative detention and other cases, I would be lying if I claim that I have a good answer now. But in principle, what I can say is that administrative detention is a breach of all the laws of the world. It's a breach or a violation of the Jordanian constitution, and because there is only one person who rules in Jordan, who is the judge, in line with the judiciary independence principles. But prosecuting someone or having him detained administratively is something that we only find in Jordan. As for recording or filming, the idea is that you can record only with permission from the prosecutor general. But when you film and you record before the judiciary, what should the judge do? Should he rely on it? No. He should get an expert to have this analyzed. And then he would ask the expert whether this is a forged or fake recording or not. And then he would ask the expert to analyze the content of this recording or this filming. And then this report by the expert will be the proof used by the judiciary. So the content or analyzing the content by this expert will be used as an evidence or as a proof. In Morocco, Jordan, Tunisia, Bahrain, Egypt, and Lebanon, filming or recording that is forbidden. It should be forbidden only when it relates to the private life. But if there is filming or recording related to uncovering a general phenomenon in Jordan, then you can move ahead, but do not defame anyone. If you are filming a documentary, a film about sexual harassment against women, do not show the perpetrator's face, because you don't want to expose them unless they are MPs or ministers. But if they are laymen, so do not show their faces, because they have families. These perpetrators might have a father, a mother, or relatives, and there is a harm here, and even his life might be at risk. So these are important issues, but I don't have the time to elaborate more on them. We should have as for having centers to provide legal assistance to journalists. I believe we do not need such centers. These centers, these voluntary centers, has created a generation of journalists who breach the rights of citizens with the pretext that I have a lawyer who can defend my case for free. Who says that you need a lawyer for free, to hire a lawyer for free? Media institutions have their own lawyers. And we have the Journalists Association, and we have the Center for the Freedom of Journalists. And you do not need voluntary legal assistance in the courts. Voluntary lawyers do not exert the required effort in the court or before justice. Now, about the laws and obstacles to modernize laws. In Jordan, the audiovisual law is not problematic, but we have problems with other laws. But if you talk about the obstacles, I can talk about this. The first obstacle is the gap between the directions of the king related to the media and between the policies of the various governments in Jordan. The successive governments do not have a clear vision on how to deal with the media. And the repeated amendments to media legislation, which are based or linked to the persons of prime ministers led to a retraction in these legislation. And also the gap between parliament and journalists led to the creation of improper laws. Also, lack of willingness of ministers to deal with the media is another obstacle. Also, we're having unprofessional journalists who have entered the media industry. So we have many obstacles to list. A lack of lawyers who defend the media also. But we need advocates, those who mobilize and defend or advocate for journalists' rights. Also, we have lack of specialization in the print media. Lack of interest in media issues because journalists do not pay money. This led to a backwardness in legislation. There is a willingness about the willingness to modernize the media laws. Yes, there is a willingness to improve the whole process, but this requires having competent people. Unfortunately, we do not have people who are competent in the area of media. We have officials in the government, and we have officials in legal committees in the parliament. Unfortunately, we do not have experts or competent people. What happens is that they are not knowledgeable enough about the media and the freedom of expression, or they do not know enough about the digital media. And so people do not lack the proper understanding and knowledge about the media industry, and that's another obstacle. Restrictions on... Thank you so much. Thank you so much for attending. I'll pay the difference. Okay.